There is something about the Caribbean at dusk that has always invited a certain kind of story. The light goes slowly there. It doesn't simply fall. It lingers, turning the water from green to gold to the deep, bruised violet of an old wound. And for a few minutes each evening, everything along that horizon looks exactly as it must have looked 300 years ago. The same sea, the same silence, broken only by the rigging and the tide. And somewhere out there, in the space between history and legend, a small sloop is running before the wind with its black flag not yet raised, waiting for the right moment. That sloop was called the William, and the couple who commanded it would become, in the short and blazing arc of their time together, perhaps the most talked about pair in all the golden age of piracy. His name was John Rackham. The world would come to know him as Calico Jack, a name stitched together from the cheap, patterned cotton he wore with a kind of swaggering indifference to anyone who found it beneath a man of his station. He was not the most feared pirate of his era. He did not command a great fleet, or terrorize entire coastlines, or accumulate a fortune that filled chests to overflowing. What Calico Jack had was something harder to measure and, in the end, far more enduring. He had audacity, he had charm, and he had, in the most consequential decision of his life, the good sense, or perhaps the helpless misfortune, to fall completely and irrevocably in love with Bonny. She was, by nearly every account that survives, extraordinary. Born somewhere in County Cork, Ireland, around 1700, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer named William Cormac, Anne had been brought to the American colonies as a child, eventually settling in the lawless, sun-soaked port of Nassau in the Bahamas, where the rules of polite society grew thin and the rum ran thick. She married young and poorly to a small-time sailor named James Bonny, a man who history has largely forgotten precisely because he deserved to be. But Bonny was not the kind of woman who remained where she was placed. When she met Calico Jack, bold, reckless, grinning, something in her recognized a matching frequency, and she made the only choice that seemed to make any sense to her at all. She left everything, stepped aboard his stolen sloop, and never looked back. What followed was a partnership so unusual, so genuinely defiant of everything the early 18th century demanded of women, that it was still being written about long after both of them were gone. Together, they raided the shipping lanes of the Caribbean with a boldness that belied the relative modesty of their operation. Their targets were often small, fishing vessels off the coast of Jamaica, merchant sloops carrying provisions between the islands, the occasional prize of greater value taken in the dark before dawn. They were not Blackbeard. They were not Bartholomew Roberts, who would capture over 400 ships in 3 years and terrorize the Atlantic from Brazil to Newfoundland. But Calico Jack and Bonny had something those names lacked: a story, a human story, tangled and passionate and tinged with the kind of romance that made people stop what they were doing and listen. Because Bonny was not a passive passenger on that ship, she fought. Witnesses would later testify to it with a kind of startled admiration they seemed barely able to contain. Dressed as a man for much of their time at sea, she worked the deck, handled weapons, and by all accounts terrified the crews of vessels they boarded in ways that went well beyond the ordinary fear of pirates. She was reportedly one of the fiercest fighters aboard the William, and she was not alone in that distinction. For sailing alongside her was another woman, Mary Read, whose own story was so improbable that it deserves its own telling. The authorities of the Caribbean wanted them badly. Governor Woodes Rogers of Nassau, a former privateer himself, a hard and practical man who had been dispatched to clean up the pirate republic the Bahamas had become, had issued a pardon to many pirates and a warrant to those who refused it. Calico Jack had accepted that pardon once, and then violated it spectacularly when he stole the William and fled with Bonny into the open sea. That made him not merely a pirate, but an embarrassment. And embarrassments in the world of colonial governance had a way of becoming urgent problems. The story of what happened next, the raids, the pursuit, the final night aboard the William when everything came undone, is one of the most vivid and haunting episodes in the entire history of piracy. But to understand the ending, we must first understand the beginning. And the beginning, like all great stories, starts not with a battle or a broadside, but with two people standing on a dock in Nassau, looking out at the water, deciding together that the ordinary world simply wasn't going to be enough. To understand Calico, Jack and Anne Bonny, you first have to understand Nassau, not the Nassau of today. That bright, ordered harbor city with its cruise ships and colonial architecture scrubbed clean by tourism and time. No, you have to understand Nassau as it existed in the years between roughly 1700 and 1718, when it was something altogether different, something the proper world had not yet found a name for, though the word they eventually settled on was simple enough: a republic. Not a republic in the formal philosophical sense that the great thinkers of Europe were beginning to debate in their salons and coffee houses. This was something rawer, less deliberate, more alive. The Bahamas in those years had become, through a combination of geography and governmental neglect, the closest thing the golden age of piracy ever produced to a true pirate utopia. Nassau sat at the northern end of New Providence Island, sheltered by a harbor too shallow for the large Royal Navy warships that might otherwise have come to restore order, and deep enough for the sloops and brigantines of those who preferred the kind of freedom that governments tend not to offer. They came from everywhere, former privateers whose official commissions had expired with the end of various wars, and who found that piracy was, in practical terms, more or less the same occupation with less paperwork. Deserters from naval vessels who had grown tired of the floggings and the scurvy, and the officers who treated them as something slightly less than human. Former slaves who had escaped or been freed and found that no respectable society was particularly interested in offering them a livelihood. Ordinary men, and a very few extraordinary women, who had looked at the life that was being offered to them and decided, with varying degrees of calculation and desperation, that they would rather take their chances at sea. At its peak, Nassau harbored somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pirates. They lived and caroused and argued and voted, and that last word is worth pausing on, because pirate ships were, in their own anarchic fashion, among the more democratic institutions of the early 18th century. Crews elected their captains. They drew up articles, contracts essentially, that laid out the rules of the voyage, the distribution of plunder, and the rights of every man aboard. A captain who made poor decisions, or who was deemed a coward in a fight, could be deposed by vote and replaced. The quartermaster served as a kind of check on the captain's authority in day-to-day matters. This was not noble governance. It was not without its brutalities and its grotesque injustices, but it was, in certain specific ways, more equitable than almost any legal alternative available to the poor and the landless of that era. Nassau was also, it must be said, thoroughly chaotic. The taverns ran day and night. The harbor was cluttered with vessels in various states of seaworthiness. Deals were made and broken. Loyalties shifted with the wind. And it was into this particular world, warm, dangerous, full of noise and possibility, and the constant low-grade tension of men living outside the law, that both Calico Jack and Anne Bonny arrived, by very different roads, and eventually found each other. John Rackham's road to Nassau ran through the quartermaster's berth of a pirate vessel commanded by a man named Charles Vane. Vane was the kind of pirate who makes historians reach for words like ruthless and volatile and occasionally unhinged. He was one of the most aggressive and uncompromising figures operating in the Caribbean during these years. A man who had, on one memorable occasion, fired a burning ship at a French naval vessel in the harbor of Nassau. rather than submit to the newly arrived Governor Woodes Rogers, and then sailed away through the chaos while most of Nassau watched, dumbfounded. He was not a man who accommodated himself easily to circumstances. John Rackham served under Vane as quartermaster, which meant he was responsible for the practical administration of the ship and the welfare of the crew. It was a position that required a particular kind of intelligence, not the blunt force of a fighting man, though Rackham was capable of that too, but the subtler ability to read a room, to understand what a group of volatile, armed, sun-damaged men needed in order to remain functional. Rackham was, by all evidence, good at this. He was observant, he was personable, and he had, underneath the calico and the easy smile, the particular ambition of a man who knew perfectly well that he was capable of more than his current position afforded. The moment that changed everything came in November of 1718, near the coast of Hispaniola. Vane's crew encountered a French man-of-war, a large, heavily armed warship, of the sort that most sensible pirates took considerable pains to avoid. Vane looked at it, made his calculation, and decided that attacking it was not worth the risk. It was, from a purely tactical standpoint, a defensible decision. The French vessel outgunned them significantly. But the crew didn't see it that way. They saw a captain flinching. They saw cowardice, or what they were prepared to call cowardice, which in the context of pirate culture amounted to much the same thing. And when a pirate crew called a vote of no confidence in their captain, the outcome tended to be swift and irreversible. Rackham led that vote. Vane was deposed, put off the ship with a small group of loyalists in a lesser vessel, and John Rackham, Calico Jack, the quartermaster in the patent Cotton, became captain. It was not a rise that came with trumpets or ceremony. It came with a show of hands on a rolling deck somewhere off Hispaniola, and then the immediate practical demands of running a ship. But it was real, and it mattered. And from that point forward, Rackham began to operate with the particular confidence of a man who has gotten the thing he wanted and intends to make it count. He was good at the work, not spectacular in the way that some of his contemporaries were, not possessed of Blackbeard's terrifying theatricality or Bartholomew Roberts' almost supernatural run of fortune, but steady, clever, and well liked by his crew. He raided shipping in the Caribbean with reasonable success. He accumulated enough plunder to maintain the loyalty of the men who sailed with him, and eventually, following a pattern common to pirates of this era, who felt the occasional need to step briefly back from the precipice, he sailed into Nassau and accepted the king's pardon that Governor Woodes Rogers was distributing with the businesslike efficiency of a man determined to transform a pirate republic into a functioning colony. It was in Nassau, newly pardoned and likely somewhat restless, that he met Bonny. Anne's road had been longer and stranger, and in certain ways far more improbable. She had been born in Ireland, County Cork most likely, around the year 1698 or thereabouts, to a lawyer named William Cormac and a woman named Mary Brennan, who worked in his household. This is the polite way of saying that Anne was illegitimate, a fact that in the rigid social architecture of early 18th century Ireland carried consequences that were both immediate and long-lasting when the affair became public knowledge. As these things invariably did in small communities where everyone's business was everyone else's entertainment, the scandal was considerable. Cormac's wife was, by various accounts, devastated and furious in roughly equal measure, and the social fallout was sufficient to convince Cormac that Ireland had become a somewhat inconvenient place to continue his career, and so he did what a certain kind of ambitious, resourceful, thoroughly compromised man tends to do when his circumstances become untenable at home. He left. He took Mary Brennan and the young Anne with him, crossed the Atlantic, and eventually established himself in Charlestown, the city we now call Charleston, in South Carolina. There, stripped of his history and surrounded by colonists who had more pressing concerns than the domestic arrangements of a newly arrived Irish lawyer, he rebuilt with remarkable efficiency. He acquired land, he built a practice, He became, by the standards of the colonial American merchant class, a respectable man of some standing. Anne grew up in this world, the world of a plantation house on the edge of a colony that was itself still finding its edges. She was, by the accounts that filtered down through court records and the later writings of Captain Charles Johnson, whose 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, remains our richest source for this era. A young woman of notable physicality and equally notable temper. Stories accumulated around her the way stories tend to accumulate around people who refuse to be contained by the expectations placed upon them. There are accounts, possibly embellished, certainly repeated, of a serving girl who made the mistake of provoking Anne's anger and found the experience considerably more eventful than anticipated. Whether or not these particular stories are strictly true is almost beside the point. What they tell us is something about the impression she made, the reputation she cultivated or perhaps simply couldn't avoid. Her father's plans for her, whatever they may have been, did not survive contact with Anne's own intentions. She married James Bonny, and she married him badly. He was a sailor of no particular distinction, a man whose most notable quality turned out to be a willingness to turn in other people for money. For when Anne and James Bonny eventually made their way to Nassau, drawn like so many others to the chaotic magnetism of that place, James Bonny found his calling in the least admirable occupation available. He became an informant for Governor Woodes Rogers, providing the authorities with information about pirates and former pirates in exchange for whatever modest compensation Rogers deemed appropriate. It is difficult to overstate how poorly this sat with Anne. The culture of Nassau, even as Rogers worked systematically to dismantle it, retained a powerful code around loyalty, around solidarity, around the particular brotherhood, and in rarer cases, sisterhood, of those who had chosen the account. Informing was the deepest betrayal available. It was not merely a moral failure in the eyes of that community. It was an act of such fundamental treachery that it placed a person outside the boundaries of any recognizable human decency, at least as decency was understood in those particular latitudes. Anne Bonny was living with an informant, and it was into this marriage, this arrangement she had made too young, with the wrong man, in a world that was changing around her faster than anyone had predicted, that Calico Jack Rackham walked, grinning in his calico, and changed everything. Their meeting is not precisely documented. No one thought to write it down at the time with the care a biographer might wish for, which is perhaps appropriate, because the best love stories rarely announce themselves. What we know is that they met. What we know is that by early 1709, the connection between them was an open secret in Nassau, an open secret that James Bonny, for all his other failings, was not entirely blind to. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that none of them, not Anne, not Jack, not the governor, not the pirate hunter who was already somewhere out there beyond the horizon, sharpening his purpose, could fully have anticipated. But the sea was warm, and the night was long, and the William sat quiet in the harbor, with its anchor down and its future unwritten. There is a moment in every life lived too small for the person inside it when something gives way. It doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it is quiet. A morning like any other morning, the light coming through the same window, the same sounds from the street outside, and a sudden absolute certainty that this, precisely this, cannot continue. Anne Bonny's moment arrived in the form of a man she could not have, in a marriage she could no longer pretend to inhabit, in a town that was rapidly closing around her like a hand making a fist. But she was not, it must be said, without options. Calico Jack Rackham, freshly pardoned and temporarily at leisure in Nassau, was doing what pardoned pirates tended to do during periods of enforced respectability. He was spending money he had accumulated through means the pardon was designed to make him forget, drinking in the establishments Nassau offered in considerable abundance, and thinking, as men of his particular temperament always think when the structure of legitimate life reasserts itself around them, about how very much he preferred the other kind. When he met Bonny, his thinking acquired a sharper focus. What passed between them in those early weeks is not recorded in any document we can access today. The courts of Nassau were not in the business of transcribing the conversations of people falling in love, and the participants themselves, for obvious reasons, did not keep journals that subsequently made their way into archives. What we can reconstruct comes from court testimony, from Captain Charles Johnson's vivid and not always reliable account, and from the logic of subsequent events, which speaks its own clear language. By early 1719, Calico Jack and Bonny were, by any practical definition, together. This presented a problem of a fairly specific legal character. Anne was still married to James Bonny. In the early 18th century, the options available to a woman who wished to leave her husband were extraordinarily limited, not merely by social convention, though social convention was formidable enough, but by law. Divorce was a matter for ecclesiastical courts and parliamentary acts, mechanisms available only to the very wealthy and the very well-connected, neither of which description applied to the wife of a Nassau informant. There was, however, a practice, extra-legal, informal, but widely acknowledged, known as divorce by sale. The concept was precisely as transactional as its name suggests. A husband, if he was willing, could essentially transfer his marital claim over his wife to another man in exchange for an agreed-upon sum. It had no standing in formal law. It was not recognized by the church, but it had a long history among the working and seafaring classes of Britain and the colonies as a pragmatic way of dissolving arrangements that had ceased to function, and it carried a social legitimacy that, in certain communities, amounted to much the same thing as the legal kind. Calico Jack, characteristically, decided to try it. He went to James Bonny and made the proposal directly, in the manner of a man who was accustomed to negotiating for things he wanted, and saw no particular reason to dress the conversation in anything other than its straightforward terms. The amount he offered is not precisely recorded, but the answer James Bonny gave is, "Now." It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because James Bonny's refusal was not, in all probability, motivated by any great depth of feeling for his wife. The portrait of him that emerges from the historical record is not that of a man in the grip of romantic anguish. More likely and more interestingly, he understood precisely what he had in Anne, not as a person he valued, but as a complication he could use. She was a problem he could report, and James Bonny had demonstrated, with considerable consistency, that reportable problems were among his most reliable resources. He went to Governor Woodes Rogers. Rogers, to his credit or his frustration depending on how one reads the moment, took the complaint seriously. He summoned Anne. He informed her that she was expected to return to her husband and conduct herself in a manner appropriate to a married woman of the colony. He may even have threatened her with a flogging, which was not an idle threat in a colony still establishing its authority through the visible application of consequences. Rogers was not a cruel man by the standards of his era, but he was a practical one, and practical men in positions of colonial governance tended to view marital disorder as a symptom of the broader social disorder they had been appointed to cure. Anne Bonny heard him out, and then she went back to Calico Jack. What Rogers's intervention clarified, more than anything else, was that the legitimate channels for what Anne and Jack wanted were not going to open. The pardon that Jack had accepted was already beginning to feel like a cage with better furniture than the last one, and the prospect of Anne being formally compelled back into her marriage while Jack watched from the respectable shore of his reformed life was, for both of them, simply not a future they were willing to inhabit. And so they made the only decision that seemed to remain. In late August of 1720, Calico Jack Rackham organized and executed a theft. The vessel in question was the William. a sloop, small and fast, owned by a man named John Ham, and sitting in Nassau Harbor with a complement of men who were either persuaded to join the enterprise or who woke up the following morning, somewhat confused about their change of employment. The accounts differ on exactly how many men were willing participants from the start, and how many were essentially recruited by the fait accompli of finding themselves already at sea by the time the sun came up. What is clear is that the William was taken without violence, which tells us something about Rackham's particular method. He preferred, when possible, the path of persuasion and momentum over outright confrontation, and Bonny was aboard. They slipped out of Nassau Harbor in the darkness, past the fort whose guns Woods Rogers had worked so diligently to restore to working order, and out into the open water of the Caribbean. Behind them, they left a pardon violated, a husband who would waste no time in making his report, and whatever remained of the ordinary life that had briefly, unsuccessfully, tried to claim them both. Ahead of them was the sea, which had always been more honest about what it was. Governor Rogers, when he learned what had happened, and he learned quickly, because James Bonny was nothing if not prompt in his informant's duties, issued a proclamation. It declared John Rackham and his crew pirates, demanded their capture, and offered, as was customary, a reward for their delivery to justice. The machinery of colonial law began its slow, expensive process of turning toward the William. But the Caribbean is large, and a small, fast sloop is very hard to find. What followed in the weeks and months after their flight from Nassau was the period that would define how history remembered them. Even if history took a while to notice it was happening, they worked the shipping lanes with the quiet efficiency of people who understood the geography of the sea they were sailing. The waters around Jamaica, Cuba, and Hispaniola were busy with commercial traffic. Fishing vessels, small merchant sloops carrying provisions and goods between the islands, the occasional larger prize that presented itself with the particular vulnerability of a ship whose crew was not expecting trouble on a calm afternoon. Calico Jack was not a pirate of grand ambitions in the Bartholomew Roberts mold. He was tactical, targeted, and selective in a way that reflected both his temperament and his resources. His crew was small. The William was not a ship designed for fleet engagements or the taking of heavily armed prizes. What she was designed for, what she excelled at, was speed, surprise, and the efficient plunder of vessels that could not outrun her, and had no particular inclination to die defending cargo that wasn't theirs. They took fishing boats off the coast of Jamaica, relieving them of their catches, and, when the vessels themselves were useful, their tackle and equipment. They stopped merchant sloops and helped themselves to provisions, cloth, rum, and whatever else the manifests of those modest vessels happened to contain. None of these were actions that would make the newspapers in London or fill the adventure books that were already beginning to romanticize the pirate life for an English reading public with an apparently bottomless appetite for maritime drama. But they were sufficient. They kept the William operational, the crew paid, and the enterprise alive. And through all of it, Anne Bonny worked. This is the part of the story that contemporaries found most remarkable and most difficult to process cleanly, because it did not fit any available category. The women on pirate ships that history had previously recorded were almost exclusively passengers, wives, captives, or cargo, present by circumstance rather than choice. Anne Bonny was none of these things. She was crew. She worked the ship, handled lines, took her place in the operations of the vessel with a matter-of-fact competence that suggested she had either learned quickly or come to the sea with more preparation than her background strictly accounted for. She also fought. When the William came alongside a prize and the business of the boarding began, Anne was there, armed, active, and by the testimony of multiple witnesses who would later appear in court, formidably effective. There is an account, repeated in various forms in the sources of the period, of a moment during a boarding action when some portion of the crew was slow to commit to the fighting, and Anne's response to this hesitation was neither patient nor diplomatic. She appears to have made her feelings on the subject unmistakably clear in language and in action. It was somewhere in these months at sea that a second extraordinary figure entered the story. Her name was Mary Read, and if Anne Bonny's life was improbable, Mary Read's was the kind of biography that a novelist would be advised to tone down for fear of straining the reader's credulity. She had been raised, for reasons that require their own careful unpacking, dressed as a boy. She had served in the British Army in Flanders, disguised as a man. She had sailed, fought, and navigated a world that offered women almost no legitimate point of entry by the simple expedient of presenting herself as something that world would accept. She had eventually made her way to the Caribbean, and at some point, the exact circumstances remain pleasantly murky. She had come aboard the William. Whether she initially concealed her identity from the crew is a matter the sources handle with some inconsistency. What seems clear is that by the time the William's final chapter was approaching, at least some aboard knew what she was, and that the two women on that ship, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, had developed between them a bond forged from the particular understanding of people who have each, in their different ways, refused the life they were assigned. For a time, the three of them, Jack, Anne, Mary, and their small crew, moved through the Caribbean in the way that all things move when the end is not yet visible. They did not know they were running out of sea. They could not have known that Woodes Rogers had already set in motion the mechanism that would find them, and that a sloop of war was already cutting through the same warm water, pointed in their direction, its captain carrying a warrant with their names on it. The autumn of 1720 was golden and slow, and almost entirely without warning, which is, more often than not, how things end. Every story of freedom, if it goes on long enough, eventually produces someone whose job it is to end that freedom. In the autumn of 1720, that someone was a man named Jonathan Barnett. He was a privateer, a legal distinction from piracy that amounted, in practical terms, to the same set of skills deployed on behalf of the correct authorities. Barnett operated under a commission from Governor Woodes Rogers, which gave him the mandate, the vessel, and the considerable personal motivation that comes from being paid to find people who would very much prefer not to be found. He was experienced, capable, and possessed of the most dangerous quality a hunter can have: patience. He did not rush. He gathered information the way a careful man gathers anything of value, methodically, without waste, waiting until the picture was complete before he committed to action. The picture he was assembling through the late summer and early autumn of 1720 was of a small sloop operating in the waters around Jamaica and the surrounding islands, whose crew had developed something of a reputation among the fishing communities and smaller vessels of those waters. Not a fearsome reputation exactly. Not the kind that made men speak in lowered voices about burned ships and massacred crews. More the reputation of a persistent and moderately successful nuisance. A vessel that appeared when it was inconvenient, took what it wanted with minimal ceremony, and disappeared again before any organized response could materialize. Information about the William came to Barnett in fragments. A fisherman off the northwest coast of Jamaica reported that his boat had been relieved of its catch and its tackle by a sloop whose crew included, memorably, 2 women fighting alongside the men. A merchant vessel reported a similar encounter. The captain's written complaint describing the boarders with the particular mixture of outrage and disbelief that characterized most official accounts of what Anne Bonny and Mary Read looked like in action. Gradually, the fragments assembled themselves into something coherent. A course, a pattern, a rough area of operation. And Jonathan Barnett, in his sloop of war, adjusted his heading accordingly. What the crew of the William were doing in the final weeks of October 1720 was, depending on how generously one reads the historical evidence, either entirely understandable or almost fatally short-sighted. They were celebrating. The specific occasion was a successful raid on a small vessel, Accounts give slightly different particulars, but the substance was consistent, and the celebration had the quality of ease that settles over people who have been doing something dangerous for long enough that the danger has begun to feel theoretical. They had evaded capture for months. The Caribbean was vast, the nights were warm, and there was rum, which has always been the sea's most reliable argument against vigilance. On the night of October 22nd, 1720, the William was anchored in a cove on the northwestern tip of Jamaica, in an area called Dry Harbor Bay. The crew had been drinking through the evening with the leisurely commitment of men who had nowhere urgent to be. The cove was quiet. The stars were clear. The kind of night that Caribbean waters produce with such gorgeous indifference. Beautiful precisely because it belongs to no one, offers nothing, and promises exactly what it delivers: darkness and silence and the sound of small waves against a wooden hull. They did not hear Barnet coming, or more precisely, because the sea does not actually permit the level of stealth that legend tends to assign to these moments. By the time they heard him, and understood what the sound meant, it was already too late for the kind of response that might have changed the outcome. Barnet's sloop came into the cove with its guns ready and its crew in the condition of men who had spent the evening doing the very thing that pirates at anchor had not: staying sober, staying alert, and following the orders of a captain who had not crossed the Caribbean to come away empty-handed. He fired a warning shot. The William returned fire. It was not, by any account we have, a particularly sustained exchange. The crucial detail that emerges from the subsequent court testimony, the detail that would follow Calico Jack Rackham into history and stain his memory in a way that no amount of earlier boldness could fully wash out, was what happened below decks. Most of the crew went down. Whether this was the paralysis of men too drunk to function, or the rational calculation of men who understood that the odds on deck were not in their favor, or simply the first instinct of people confronted with sudden violence who lacked the particular wiring required to run toward it. The historical record does not trouble itself to be precise on this point. What it records, with the unsparing directness of court depositions, is the outcome. The men of the William's crew retreated below, while the fight on deck went on without them. The fight on deck was conducted, in the main, by two women. Bonny and Mary Reed did not go below. The witnesses who testified at the subsequent trial were consistent on this point in a way that carries its own weight, because witnesses at piracy trials in 1720 had no particular incentive to embellish in favor of the accused. What they described was Anne and Mary fighting on the deck of the William with a commitment and a fury that stood in absolute and damning contrast to the behavior of the men sheltering beneath them. There are accounts of Mary Reed shouting down the hatch at the hiding crew. Her words, as recorded or reconstructed by Johnson, carrying the particular scorn of someone who has found that the people she is fighting beside have decided, at the critical moment, that they would rather not. It was not enough. Two people against a prepared crew with superior numbers, and the element of having arrived sober to a fight they had been planning for days, was not an equation that courage alone could solve. The William was boarded. The crew was taken. Calico Jack Rackham, the man in the patterned cotton who had deposed the captain for cowardice and taken his ship, was found below decks. He was brought up into the night air, and the Caribbean was still warm, and the stars were still there, and none of it meant anything different than it had meant an hour ago, except that everything had changed. The prisoners were taken to Port Royal, Jamaica. Port Royal was, by 1720, a city with its own complicated relationship to piracy. It had once been the most active pirate haven in the Caribbean, a place so thoroughly given over to the business of freebooters and privateers that it had acquired a reputation as the wickedest city in the world, a description it appeared to wear with some civic pride. Then, in 1692, an earthquake had dropped 2/3 of the city into the sea in approximately 2 minutes, which many observers of a religious persuasion found meaningful. and the city had rebuilt itself in a somewhat more restrained fashion. By 1720, Port Royal was the seat of Jamaican colonial authority, and it was here that the legal machinery of the British Empire intended to make its point. The point, when it came to piracy, was always the same. It was made with rope, and it was made in public, and it was made with a deliberateness designed to communicate something useful to anyone watching from the harbor with a ship of their own and ambitions they might be reconsidering. The prisoners from the William were held while the authorities assembled the court, gathered witnesses, and prepared the formal apparatus of justice. In the days between capture and trial, Calico Jack Rackham and Anne Bonny were permitted to see each other. The accounts of what passed between them in these meetings carry the weight of people who know, with the particular clarity that desperate circumstances tend to produce, exactly where they stand. It was not a comfortable reckoning. Anne, by the account that has come down to us, filtered through Johnson, who may have embellished, but who was writing close enough in time to events to have access to people who were there, did not offer Calico Jack the comfort he might have hoped for. She was not, by temperament or by the evidence of her entire life, a woman who softened things for the sake of kindness when directness was available. What she reportedly said to him, in words that have echoed through 3 centuries of pirate literature, was something to the effect that she was sorry to see him where he was, but that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. It is a brutal thing to say to a man facing execution. It is also, if one accepts the account as substantially accurate, completely consistent with everything we know about Anne Bonny. She had fought. He had not. The facts were what they were, and Anne Bonny appears to have been congenitally incapable of pretending otherwise. The trial of Calico Jack Rackham and his crew was held on November 16, 1720, at St. 20, Jago de la Vega, also known as Spanish Town, before a vice-admiralty court whose business was brisk and whose outcome was not in serious doubt from any practical standpoint. The charge was piracy. The evidence was substantial. The witnesses were willing. The proceedings moved with the efficiency of a legal system that had conducted enough of these trials to know exactly how they went. Rackham was found guilty. So were the men of his crew, or most of them. Several claimed to have been taken aboard the William against their will, a defense that the court examined with varying degrees of credulity depending on the specifics of each case. The core of the crew, those who had been clearly willing participants in the voyage and the raids, were convicted without significant difficulty. The sentence was death. Calico Jack Rackham was hanged at Gallows Point, Port Royal, on November 18, 1720. He was, in the fashion of the time and of that particular location, gibbeted afterward, his body placed in an iron cage and hung at the harbor entrance, as a warning to those arriving and departing by sea. The place where this was done was known as Rackham's Cay, a name it kept for years afterward, which is a kind of memorial, though not the kind anyone would have chosen. He was not yet 40 years old. He had been a captain for barely 2 years. He had spent those 2 years in the company of one of the most remarkable women the golden age of piracy would produce, sailing a sea that was already beginning to close around the entire era of which he was a part. And he had ended, as so many of that era ended, at the end of a rope in a colonial harbor, while the ships moved in and out, and the water went on being exactly what it had always been, indifferent and gorgeous and entirely unconcerned with the affairs of the people who sailed it. The women's trial came shortly after. Anne Bonny and Mary Red were tried separately from the men, in a proceeding that followed the same basic structure and arrived at the same basic conclusion. Both were found guilty of piracy. Both were sentenced to death. And then something happened that neither of them may have planned, but which changed the immediate arithmetic of their situation entirely. Both women were pregnant. The law of the era, English common law, carried across the Atlantic in the holds of ships alongside everything else. The British Empire transported to its colonies contained a provision known as pleading the belly. A woman condemned to death who was found to be with child could claim a stay of execution, the reasoning being that the unborn child had committed no crime and should not be punished for the sins of its mother. The claim had to be verified by a jury of matrons, women appointed by the court to confirm the pregnancy, and if confirmed, execution was delayed until after the child was delivered. Both women pleaded their pregnancies. Both were confirmed. Both received their stays. And at that precise moment, the stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, which had run together for months in the warmth and danger of the Caribbean, began to diverge toward very different endings. Mary Read died in prison. The records are sparse on the details. They tend to be sparse on the details of women in the 18th century, particularly women who died in colonial Jamaican jails without families of standing to commission their memorials or preserve their letters. What the records indicate is that she died in April of 1721, a matter of months after the trial, likely from a fever of the kind that moved through the crowded, poorly ventilated spaces of colonial imprisonment with the casual lethality of something that did not need to hurry because the conditions would do the work eventually. She was given a prison burial. There is no known grave marker. There is no monument. There is the entry in the record, and there is the account in Captain Johnson's book, published 3 years later, which treated her story with a kind of admiring energy that suggests even a writer accustomed to the outlandish material of the Golden Age found her remarkable. Johnson devoted considerable space to the arc of her life. The childhood dressed as a boy, the army service in Flanders, the Atlantic crossing, the months aboard the William, and what emerges from his account, even filtered through his particular literary sensibility and his tendency to embellish in the service of a good story, is the portrait of a person of extraordinary adaptability and nerve. Mary Read had spent her entire life moving through a world that was not designed for her by finding the gaps in its architecture and passing through them. She had been, in the most literal sense, someone who refused the shape the world tried to press her into, though this refusal eventually brought her to a Jamaican prison, and a fever burial is one of history's grimmer ironies, but it does not diminish the extraordinary distance she had traveled to get there. She was, in all probability, still in her early 30s when she died. Anne Bonny's fate is, in its own way, even more remarkable, not because of what happened to her, but because of what did not happen and because of how thoroughly the historical record simply loses her. She does not appear to have been executed. This much seems clear. There is no record of her hanging. There is no gibbeting, no official account of her death in custody, no subsequent newspaper notice of the kind that colonial authorities tended to generate when disposing of convicted pirates, because the disposal of convicted pirates was, among other things, a public relations exercise. The execution of Calico, Jack and his crew, was documented. The deaths of other pirates tried in Jamaica in this period were documented. Anne Bonny's is not. What did happen to her is a question that historians have been sitting with, somewhat comfortably, for 3 centuries. The most plausible explanation, supported by what circumstantial evidence exists, is that her father intervened. William Cormac, the Irish lawyer who had reinvented himself in the colonies, who had built a respectable practice and a plantation in Carolina, whose illegitimate daughter had become, through a chain of choices he could not possibly have anticipated, one of the most talked about pirates in the Caribbean, was, by 1720, a man of some standing and presumably some resources. Standing and resources, in the colonial world of the early 18th century, had a long history of purchasing outcomes that the law's bare text did not technically permit. The suggestion is that Cormac secured Anne's release through means that the surviving records do not detail, that money changed hands, that connections were employed, that the colonial machinery, which was never so rigid that it could not be nudged by the right application of influence, was nudged. It is speculation, but it is the kind of speculation that fits the available facts with reasonable comfort. What seems to have happened is that Anne Bonny, at some point in 1721, left Jamaica. She appears to have returned, eventually, to the Carolinas. There is a record, debated by historians, treated with appropriate caution, of an Anne Bonny marrying a man named Joseph Burleigh in South Carolina in 1721, and of a woman of that name living out a long and, by all available evidence, quiet life, producing a number of children, dying at an advanced age somewhere in the middle of the 18th century. Whether this is the Anne Bonny is not something the historical record is willing to confirm with any certainty. The name was not uncommon. The details align imperfectly, and there is something almost deliberately evasive about the way the trail simply softens and disperses, as if the woman herself decided, at some point after Jamaica, that she had been sufficiently visible for one lifetime and would prefer, going forward, to be left alone. If it is her, and the balance of scholarly opinion tilts gently but not conclusively in that direction, then what we are looking at is one of history's more quietly extraordinary conclusions. The woman who had crossed the Atlantic, married badly, fallen in love scandalously, sailed as crew on a pirate vessel, fought on its deck while men hid below, been tried and condemned and reprieved. That woman came home. She settled. She lived a life whose texture we cannot access. She may have grown old. She may have sat on some Carolina evening, listening to the sound of something that was not quite the sea, and thought about the William and the way the Caribbean looked in the early morning with the light just beginning and the flag not yet raised. Or she may not have. She may have been, by then, completely and genuinely finished with all of it. The adventure, the danger, the story that other people were already beginning to tell about her, without asking her permission. We do not know. And there is something appropriate in that. Anne Bonny entered history sideways, through a door that was not designed for her, in a role that no available category adequately described. It is fitting, perhaps, that she left it the same way, not with an ending that the record could tidy into a final paragraph, but with a disappearance, a softening of outline, a life that continued beyond the point where the story felt it needed to stop. Captain Charles Johnson published a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates in 1724, 4 years after the capture of the William and 3 years after the deaths of Calico, Jack and Mary Read, and the disappearance of Anne Bonny into whatever remained of her life. The book was a sensation. It went through multiple editions. It was read in London coffee houses and colonial parlors, and aboard ships whose captains may have had complicated feelings about its subject matter. It contained accounts of Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts and Charles Vane, and dozens of other figures from the Golden Age, rendered with Johnson's particular gift for making the dangerous and the disreputable feel vivid and almost sympathetic without ever quite crossing the line into open endorsement. The chapters on Anne Bonny and Mary Read were among the most discussed. Johnson treated them with a mixture of admiration and the kind of slightly baffled respect that the era afforded to women who had done things women were not supposed to be able to do. He emphasized their courage, their fighting ability, their refusal to behave in the ways their gender was supposed to mandate. He told their stories with an energy that suggested he understood, even if he could not quite articulate it in the language available to him in 1724, that what these women represented was something more than a colorful footnote to the larger story of the Golden Age. They represented a crack in the architecture, not a revolution. The world did not change because Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed on a pirate sloop in the Caribbean for a year or so. The structures of the 18th century were not that fragile, and history is rarely that tidy. But a crack nonetheless. A demonstration visible and documented and subsequently widely read. that the categories the world insisted upon were not as solid as they presented themselves, that a woman could fight, could choose, could refuse the life assigned to her, and take a different one, even at enormous cost, even with the full weight of law and custom and colonial authority arrayed against her. The story spread because stories like this one always spread. There is a particular kind of story that history keeps telling, not because historians insist upon it, but because something in the human imagination refuses to let it go. It is the story of people who looked at the world as it was arranged, its rules, its walls, its careful allocation of freedom to those deemed worthy of it, and decided, with varying degrees of desperation and exhilaration and simple practical necessity, to go around, not through, not by changing the rules from within or petitioning the authorities or finding some acceptable channel for their unacceptable desires. Around, sideways, out the door that wasn't supposed to open, into the water that wasn't supposed to be theirs. Calico, Jack Rackham, and Bonny are, 300 years later, among the most recognized names of the golden age of piracy. This is not because they were its most successful practitioners. They were not. The numbers, if one is in the business of measuring piratical achievement numerically, do not favor them particularly. Bartholomew Roberts captured over 400 vessels across 3 years of almost supernatural fortune on the Atlantic. Blackbeard terrorized the American colonial coast with a theatrical genius that understood, long before the age of modern branding, that reputation was its own kind of weapon. Even Charles Vane, the man Calico Jack helped depose, operated at a scale that exceeded what the William ever achieved. And yet, ask someone today to name 2 pirates from the Golden Age who were real people, and the answer, more often than not, will include Anne Bonny. Ask what they know about her, and the answer will include the fact that she was a woman, that she fought, that she chose this life, deliberately at considerable cost, against the full opposition of everything her era arranged to prevent exactly that kind of choice. That is what the story kept, not the ledger of raids or the tonnage of plunder. The fact of the choice and the woman who made it. The reasons for this are worth sitting with, because they tell us something not only about Anne Bonny and Calico Jack, but about what we need from history and why we need it. The golden age of piracy has always attracted a romanticized popular imagination that serious historians view with appropriate wariness. The reality of piracy in the early 18th century was considerably less glamorous than its mythology. More disease, more violence, more desperate poverty, driving men to desperate choices, less treasure and adventure and freedom than the books and films and games have tended to suggest. Pirates were not, in the main, romantic figures. They were people at the brutal edge of the Atlantic economy, operating in the spaces where the law was thin and the alternatives were worse, making choices that we should be careful not to simply celebrate, because the distance of 3 centuries has softened their consequences. But within that reality, within the hardship and the violence and the early deaths, and the gibbeted bodies hanging at harbor entrances as object lessons for the next generation, there were also genuine acts of refusal, genuine moments when people who had been handed a script they did not write, looked at it carefully and set it down. Anne Bonny's refusal was particular and personal. She did not articulate a philosophy. She did not write pamphlets or make speeches or consciously position herself as a symbol of anything beyond her own desire to live differently than the life available to her. She was not thinking about history when she stepped aboard the William in the dark of a Nassau night. She was thinking about Jack and about the sea and about everything that the alternative represented. But symbols do not require intention. They require only that something is true in them that speaks to a question other people are carrying. The question Anne Bonny's story speaks to is one that has not aged. It is the question of what we do when the life we are offered is not the life we are capable of living. When the category we have been placed in does not contain us, when the choices available within the rules are not adequate to what we are. There is no clean answer in her story. The ending, if the Carolina theory is correct, is quiet. A long domestic life far from the Caribbean. The adventure absorbed into something more ordinary. The famous name carried forward by a woman who may have been working hard not to be recognized by it. That is not the triumphant conclusion that legend tends to prefer. It is more complicated, more human, more true to what actually happens when extraordinary circumstances give way, as they always do eventually, to the ongoing work of simply living. Calico Jack's legacy is, by contrast, somewhat more ambivalent, and the historical record is not especially gentle with it. He was, in many ways, the least remarkable person in his own story. He was competent and likable and bold enough for the life he chose, but history would likely not have kept his name with the same tenacity, if not for the woman who sailed with him. The image of Rackham hiding below decks while Anne Bonny and Mary Red fought on the deck above him is not the image of a man who will be remembered for his courage, and history, which is often more honest about these things than we might wish, has not pretended otherwise. And yet there is something in Calico Jack that also deserves a kind of careful looking at, something that the mockery of that final night tends to obscure. He was, by the evidence of his actions before that night, a man of real capability and genuine human warmth. His crew, by most accounts, liked him. He was not a sadist or a casual killer in the way that some of his contemporaries were. He had the particular quality of leadership that rests on persuasion rather than terror, which is rarer and in some ways more admirable than the alternative, even when deployed in the service of piracy. He also, and this should not be forgotten, created the conditions in which Anne Bonny's story became possible. He was the one who pursued her, who attempted the negotiation with James Bonny, who stole the William, who brought her to sea. His ambitions and his affections were the mechanism by which the whole thing was set in motion. Whether that is to his credit or his account is a question the reader must settle for themselves. But it is not nothing. His flag, at least, endured. The Jolly Roger that Calico Jack flew, a skull above two crossed cutlasses on a black field, became one of the most recognized pirate symbols in history. Whatever its precise origins, that particular design has traveled far beyond the William and the Caribbean of 1720. It appears on flags and tattoos, and the iconography of piracy in popular culture, with a persistence that suggests it found, in its simple geometry, exactly the right visual language for the idea it was meant to communicate. The William is long gone, dissolved back into wood and salt and time, as all ships eventually are. Nassau looks nothing like it did in 1720. The pirate republic is a historical abstraction now, studied in books, reconstructed in museums, visited by tourists who stand at the edge of the harbor and try, with varying degrees of success, to hear in the present port the echo of the past one. The water is the same water. That much is constant. The Caribbean does not change, because the people who sail it change. Rackham's Cay, where Calico Jack was gibbeted, no longer goes by that name in any official sense. Port Royal has its own complicated relationship to the history of piracy, to the earthquake, to the centuries that have passed over it with the thoroughness of all those centuries. What remains is what always remains. The geography, the light on the water, and the stories that attach themselves to a place and refuse to leave. Mary Read's grave is unmarked and unknown. Her life, which was by any measure astonishing, exists primarily in Johnson's account and in the downstream cultural memory that account generated. She deserves more than she has received from the historical imagination, which tends to cast her as the supporting player in Anne Bonny's story, when the truth is that their situations were structurally almost identical. Two women who refused the available categories, who fought when the men around them did not, who were condemned and then separated by the accident of survival, and Bonny, who may have been, for decades, simply a woman in the Carolinas, with a name she had reasons not to discuss too loudly, goes on being the figure that the imagination returns to, not because her piracy was exceptional, not because her relationship with Calico Jack was unique in any technical sense, but because the image of her is so clear, even across 3 centuries, a woman on a deck, armed, fighting, refusing. That image has a staying power that no amount of historical qualification seems able to diminish. It speaks to something that does not require the 18th century to be meaningful. The world still arranges itself, in its various ways, into categories that do not always contain the people placed inside them. The lives on offer are still, for many people, not the lives they are capable of living. The sea, metaphorical, actual, whatever form the open water takes in any given life, is still out there. And somewhere in the human imagination, a small, fast sloop is still running before the wind on a Caribbean evening, its flag not yet raised, its future unwritten, and 2 people on its deck who have decided, recklessly, lovingly, at great cost, without sufficient planning, that the ordinary world was simply not going to be enough. 300 years later, we are still watching them go. Calico Jack Rackham was executed at Port Royal, Jamaica on November 18, 1720. Mary Red died in prison, Port Royal, April 1721, and Bonny's ultimate fate remains, beautifully and fittingly, unknown.